Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Heritage Toronto tour, the Junction Triangle Neighborhood in Motion. My name is Jeff Junk. I'm a board member with Heritage Toronto. I've been a board member for about 2 years, but a very exciting development for me is that this is actually my first tour. As many of you, I'm sure, can assume, we unfortunately had to hold off on tours last year. So for me, this is a really exciting moment because I'm able to connect with about 30 of you on the call today and enjoy a really great presentation by Quinton Bradshaw. Before I hand it over to Quinton, I just have a few things that I would like to cover. The first is I want to acknowledge, and even though we are all joining virtually today, I do want to acknowledge that Heritage Toronto is on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, including the Chippewas, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, Toronto is host to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Toronto is within the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which requires responsibility of those who use the land to share it peaceably and care for it. Heritage Toronto also acknowledges this responsibility and recognizes the efforts of these nations in maintaining the land. And if you aren't in Toronto joining us today, I really do encourage you to look up the traditional territories in your area and start to learn about those peoples. Founded in 1999, we acknowledge that Heritage Toronto has contributed to the colonial historical narrative. We're working to amend that by engaging with Indigenous communities to incorporate more of their stories into our programming. Plaques with colonial language are being revised. Indigenous content is being integrated into our walking tours. And in the future, we hope to expand our Indigenous programming. Now, if you're new to Heritage Toronto or you're joining for the first time, I just want to share that Heritage Toronto is a charity and we are an agency of the City of Toronto. We celebrate our city's rich heritage and the diverse stories of its people, places, and events. Through our programs, including tours like this, our plaques, our State of Heritage Report, and other online exhibits, we engage the public to reflect on the past, both to make sense of our present and to inform our future. Now, as a charity, I'm sure it comes as no surprise that we have some really great sponsors that make tours like this possible. So I do want to thank our 2021 presenting sponsor, TD, as well as our tour sponsor, Andrew and Sharon Himmel and the Himmel family. Without support from people and organizations like this, tours and all of our programs just wouldn't be possible. If you do have any questions during the tour, I just want to give a quick reminder that there's actually a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you can put any of your questions into that function, we'll make sure we answer as many of them we can at the end. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, because she is the most important person here today, our presenter, Quinton Bradshaw, is an arts worker, audio storyteller, and illustrator based in Toronto. As a community outreach coordinator at CJRU 1280 AM, she produces radio stories in partnership with community organizations and has previously worked for Hot Docs, the Word on the Street Festival, and CBC Network Talk. She holds a degree in media production. And with that, I will stop talking, and Quinton, I will let you take over.
Thanks, Jeff. Awesome. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. Thanks for joining me digitally for this tour. I'm going to try and start sharing my screen. Please flag in the chat if there's any issues, but otherwise, I'm going to pull up a little presentation, some images to share with you all. So kind of get that going. Yeah, like I said, just drop in the chat if you're having trouble seeing anything, but otherwise, I'm going to get started. So yeah, as Jeff said, this tour, as I'm sure you know, is the Junction Triangle, a neighborhood in motion. And today we're going to be diving into some of the history of the Junction Triangle. So for this digital tour, we're going to kind of roughly be following this route of stops. And without further ado, I think I'm going to get right into stop one on this tour. So our very first stop on this tour looks a bit at how the Junction Triangle came to be, both by name and just geographically, how this area became the Junction Triangle. And so to start that off, we'll be starting up at Dupont Street and Dundas Street West, which is notably a location that is one of the major intersections of railway lines. So I'm going to just hop over here. This is a old Atlas of Toronto image. So you can see right up here, that is the railway line intersection. And the reason that we're starting at the intersection of railway lines is because this is kind of at the heart of both of the things we're getting into, why the Junction Triangle physically is what it is and why it's named what it is. So to start, we'll look a little bit more at recent history, about the past decade, 12 years of history, and how the Junction Triangle actually became to be known as the Junction Triangle. So for anyone who's not aware, I've done a little Google Maps graphic for you. So clearly the Junction Triangle, the triangle piece of the name was inspired by the fact that this neighborhood is bordered by 3 railway lines that together make up a triangle. So there's one along here that kind of follows roughly along Dundas Street West, another just to the west of Lansdowne, and then the third that crosses just north of DuPont Street. So the fact that these railway lines make up a triangle seems like a pretty obvious basis for a name. It's kind of an obvious basis for a name, but the actual story of how they arrived upon that name is a little bit more interesting. So in 2009, a group of residents from the Junction Triangle neighborhood came together and formed a project called the Fuzzy Boundaries Initiative. And at that time in 2009, the Junction Triangle was not the Junction Triangle. For most people in Toronto, they kind of largely knew it as unnamed slice of land with a lot of abandoned industrial land in West Toronto. And people in the neighborhood also were aware that this is how people knew the neighborhood. And they could see that probably soon developers would be moving in and starting to, buy up all that abandoned industrial land. And they wanted to make sure that the Junction Triangle was not, although it was not known as that then, that the neighborhood was named by the people who lived there and not some kind of developer's marketing strategy. So they put out a call for people to name the neighborhood, and they initially got 230 submissions, so great uptake. By the spring of 2010, they managed to whittle that initial field of 230 down to just 10 contenders, which featured things like Railtown, Rail District. Again, you can see the influence of the railways, as well as East Junction, Perth Park, which is named for a park right in the middle of the neighborhood, right there, Black Oak Triangle, and the Wedge. However, obviously, none of these contenders prevailed. The Junction Triangle ultimately won with just over 50% of the vote. And I think this is also kind of a good place for me to note that the Junction Triangle is also named quite similarly to another Toronto neighborhood you may be familiar with, the Junction, which is just to the northwest of here. And I just want to flag that just in case people aren't aware of the distinction, because there are a couple of points in this tour where I'll refer to the Junction. So just to avoid confusion, if I'm talking about the Junction, I'm talking about the Junction neighborhood up here. I'm not sure if folks can see when I point on the screen. Hopefully you can see my mouse, but it's to the northwest of the Junction Triangle neighborhood. So the Junction Triangle as a neighborhood by name has only been around for about 11, 12 years. But this actual area has been defined by the movement and motion of people, services, and goods that goes back to almost 14,000 years. 14,000 years ago, the neighborhood that is now known as the Junction Triangle actually would have been completely underwater, under the waters of glacial Lake Iroquois. In fact, basically everything south of Davenport Road, which is just north of here, just off the map, was all underwater, and Davenport Road would have been the northern shore of the lake. It was an escarpment, and many Indigenous folks who lived in the area used that escarpment to travel back and forth between the Humber River to the west of the Junction Triangle and the Don River to the east of the Junction Triangle for thousands of years pre-colonization. Many artifacts up to 10,000 years old found along Davenport Road have helped folks come to this conclusion. And experts believe that Indigenous hunters at the time would camp along the shore while following caribou migration routes. However, at some point, the Laurentide ice sheet melted, the lake receded, and the trading routes changed with it. However, changing the Indigenous way of life in a far more drastic and violent fashion was the arrival of European colonizers in the 1600s and 1700s. The Junction Triangle was the land of the Mississauga, it was Mississauga territory, but the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and then further negotiations in 1783 saw the new British arrivals essentially claim control of the land for their own. This was then formalized in 1805 by the Toronto Purchase Agreement. And so all of this would suggest that fair due process occurred, but that wasn't really the case. The Toronto Purchase Claim was submitted by the Mississauga Tribal Claims Council in 1986, and it disputed that a proper surrender of the land had ever occurred. This was finally supported by the Canadian government in 2002 when they released a statement that an outstanding lawful obligation is owed to the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation based on a breach agreement in relation to the 1805 Toronto Purchase Surrender. It feels really important to acknowledge all of this off the top of the tour because for the next hour or so, we're going to be talking about the history of this area for about the past 100 years, past century plus. And by that point, Indigenous people and culture had largely been driven off the land. And that's due mainly to the actions of European colonizers. But when we're telling these stories, it's really important that we remember that despite that, Indigenous people were on this land for thousands of years before anyone else, and we still owe a great debt to them today. And yeah, so even if we're not, digging into their stories, it's just important that we remember that were here before anyone else and still are 4% of the Canadian population today. And yeah, just a great debt is owed to them. And, one of the ways in which we can see that is, again, in these trading routes that I was just talking about that they used to follow. Because bringing it back to the rail lines once again, when rail lines started to be built in the area, many of them followed original trading routes that had already long been established by these Indigenous communities. So one of those trading routes was used as the basis of one of the very first rail lines in the area, the Georgetown Rail Corridor on the west side of the neighborhood, which had the very first track laid on it in 1853 by the Ontario, Simcoe, and Huron Railway. In the following 3 decades, many more railways followed suit. The Grand Trunk, the Toronto Grand Bruce, the Credit Valley in Ontario and Quebec all built their own rail lines. And by 1883, the triangle that we know today was fully established. I just threw a lot of railway line names and dates at you, but this is just important to talk about because if you know much about the history of city building, you might know that often rail lines coming to an area can change everything. And that was certainly true for the Junction Triangle area. Prior to the rail lines, it was, at that point, largely just undeveloped farmland, but within just over a century, it first became an industrial hub. And even now, in 2017, Now Magazine has declared the Junction Triangle Toronto's #1 next hot neighborhood. So it's really been a century plus of incredible change for the Junction Triangle, and they have many stories to show for it. And tonight we're going to be exploring some more of those stories. So with that, we're going to head on to our next stop. Oh, and sorry, I really did not show you these images, but here we have some people working on laying down the track. This was a little later, this wasn't initial, but this was the crossing at Dundas and DuPont, the Diamond Crossing in West Toronto. And even today, you can see we still have the West Toronto Rail Path, which follows along the Georgetown Rail Corridor also. So our next stop on this tour is at 153 Franklin Avenue, which is important as a very early community hub in the Junction Triangle's earliest days as a growing residential neighborhood, a growing community. So by the early 1900s, a couple decades after the triangle had been completed, the Junction Triangle was a very, very busy reception area for immigrants to Toronto. In fact, it was one of the top 2 most popular reception areas, the other being St. John's Ward in downtown Toronto. And Ukrainian, Macedonian, Italian, Polish, and Portuguese family had begun flocking to the neighborhood, putting down roots. A lot of people came to the Junction Triangle at this time because many of these families newly arrived in Canada were looking for work. And at that point, the Junction Triangle had really begun to become a bit of an industrial hub. So there was lots of work to be found in the area. People looking for work could find it in feed yards and factories and planing mills, making batteries and nails and bread. So there was plenty of work to be found in the area. But while, work was in abundance, a sense of community in those earliest days was still somewhat lacking, especially for a lot of these communities who were, finding themselves far from home and far from maybe their wider family community. So a lot of these communities began, going to work, setting up their own community hubs. A number of them can still be found in the area today, although some of them have since moved on. And we're going to be talking about one of the most prominent ones at 173 Franklin Avenue, which is the St. Josephats Catholic Cathedral in this picture. So St. Josephats is, by many accounts, the oldest Ukrainian institution in the city of Toronto. Because when many of these Ukrainian families started to arrive in the area, there was no Ukrainian church in the area. However, in any given evening of 1909, if you headed just north of Franklin Avenue to the corner of Franklin and Edith and went into the living room of the house sitting on the corner, you might have found it packed with Ukrainian worshippers holding a divine liturgy. This was an okay short-term solution, probably nice for the time being, but it was not really a great long-term solution for the worshippers, and especially not for the homeowner. So the community came together and wrote a letter to Toronto's Archbishop Nicolay, asking if they could please send them a Catholic Ukrainian bishop and priest to save them from the area's Protestants. Lo and behold, their prayers were answered, and by 1911, they had a priest, a parish, and the deed to the piece of land that St. Josephats Catholic Cathedral is now built on. No word how the Protestants were dealt with, but by 1914, the church was complete, or at least the church's exterior was complete. At the time, they didn't actually have the budget to complete the interior, so that was a project that ended up lasting the next 27 years as they just put it together piece by piece, a pew here, a pulpit there, as parishioners came in with generous donations as they could afford it. However, despite the unfinished interior, the building was in use pretty much constantly ever since it was completed in 1914 and was quickly home to a choir, a school, and other organizations, as well as, of course, many services. Meanwhile, up on DuPont Street, the Toronto West branch of the Ukrainian National Federation was founded and was home to a library, a performance group, and even a hunting and fishing club. Well, the Ukrainian National Federation on DuPont has since closed up shop and moved on. St. Josephats is still in the neighborhood, and this community built in the earliest days has actually lasted for over a century. The congregation celebrated their 100th anniversary in 2014. Slightly less long-lasting than that sense of community was actually the original cathedral building, which was completely destroyed in a fire in 1964. However, this time they had the funds and the means to much more swiftly rebuild it. And by 1965, just 1 year after the fire, the building was completely rebuilt, interior and exterior, and it is still standing today. So that's, if you go to 143 Franklin Avenue, that's what you're going to see, this building right to the right here. And with that, I'm going to take us along to our next stop. So stop 3, a boxing legend. This stop is at 50 Sousa Mendes Street in the Junction Triangle. And this is home to the George Chavallo Neighborhood Center. I'm not sure who's familiar with George Chavallo here, but he is one of the Junction Triangle's most famous residents. And he was born and raised in the Junction Triangle area. So George Chavallo was actually one of Canada's most successful, one of the world's most successful heavyweight boxers while he was fighting. He was in the world's top 10 for most of his 21-year career. But before all that, he was just a working class kid growing up in the Junction Triangle neighborhood. He was born in 1937 and he grew up on Hook Avenue, which is, I'll actually go back a slide, just a bit northwest of here, than where you can see on the map. His parents had immigrated to Canada from Croatia, and they both found jobs at slaughterhouses in the area. So while George Chavallo was in elementary school just north of Edwin Street, his mom was hard at work just a few blocks to the east at the Royce DuPont chicken packers plant. He started high school at Humberside Collegiate and immediately got really into boxing. He rose up through Toronto's amateur heavyweight ranks and gaining quite a reputation for himself. And in 1955, he became Canada's amateur heavyweight boxing champion. He went pro just 1 year later in 1956, and he quickly rose through those ranks as well, having many tough fights and more than holding his own. One of his highest profile opponents you might recognize in this photograph was Muhammad Ali, who he fought in a very high profile fight at Maple Leaf Gardens in 1966. And after which that fight, Muhammad Ali declared George Chavallo the toughest guy he ever fought. I actually have a short clip from that fight that I want to share with you. I realize I might have to stop sharing for a sec. I think I forgot to share sound when I started doing this. So give me 1 second to get that set up. I'm sorry, and I'm just seeing the chat. I will go slower. Sorry about that. I did not catch that sooner, but thank you very much for that feedback. Sorry. Sorry, everyone. Okay. Okay, yeah, so this is just, we've got about a 2-minute clip from the Muhammad Ali versus George Chavallo fight. And this is just going to start right before the fight starts. And it's going to play for about 2 minutes. So I'm going to just let that play.
Well, they're both charged up. Make no mistake about that. The bell for round one. The champion wearing white trunks, scoring with a left and a right. Cevallo in black trunks. Solid left hook scored by Chavallo. Chavallo, of course, is expected to go for the body. Solid left hook for the champion, that one connected, and a good jab. The champion has a certain type of jab. Some fighters will sting you.
Okay, yeah, so that's just a little clip from that. I wanted to make sure that you could see George Chavallo got at least a couple good hits in. He did eventually lose the fight, but it did go a full 15 rounds, which may be partly why Ali called him the toughest guy he ever fought. And at the time, Muhammad Ali was actually fighting in Canada because he was a conscious objector to the Vietnam War, and so he had been banned from fighting in America at the time. So not great for him probably, but it was probably kind of great and exciting for everyone who got to go to Maple Leaf Gardens and see that fight. Okay, there we go. George Chavallo retired from boxing undefeated as Canada's heavyweight champion in 1979, and he pivoted almost immediately to working in drug prevention advocacy work for Canadian youth. George Chavallo had actually lost 3 sons and his wife to substance abuse issues, and overcoming these tragedies to become a tireless advocate for youth drug prevention might just be the toughest thing he actually ever did. He received the Order of Canada for his work in 1998. And now in the Junction Triangle neighborhood, opening just a couple years ago, they have the George Chavallo Neighborhood Center. The center has services focused on kids and youth, as well as special services for LGBTQ youth. And as his son said at the center's opening ceremony, its mission is a credit to George Chavallo's work and a fitting tribute to a Canadian icon and hero. And speaking of Junction Triangle icons, we're gonna, maybe could somebody put, okay, we've gone ahead 2 slides. Sorry, I'm having some slide trouble. Okay, so another icon in the Junction Triangle neighborhood, a bridge, the Wallace Avenue Pedestrian Bridge. So the Wallace Avenue Pedestrian Bridge today is probably one of the more notable landmarks of the Junction Triangle neighborhood. And it has been since it was built in 1907, but it actually was not supposed to be permanent. So in 1907, the Junction Triangle neighborhood, or prior to 1907 really, the Junction Triangle neighborhood was a bit of an island in that it was quite hard to get to and hard to leave. So for people who worked in the neighborhood but lived maybe on Dundas West on the opposite side of the rail tracks, they would have to go all the way north to DuPont or south to Bloor across a couple of potentially very hazardous crossings, which we'll talk a little bit more about actually in a little bit, and then back up into the neighborhood to get to work. And, vice versa for anyone living in the neighborhood who wanted to get over to Dundas West to access the streetcar, which only ran north-south along Dundas West if they want to get downtown. So this was a bit of an issue for all involved. Enter the Ontario Bridge Company with a temporary solution to this problem, the Wallace Avenue Pedestrian Bridge. For anyone who is really interested in bridges, this bridge is a multi-span steel worn pony truss footbridge. All those words might not mean very much to you. They did not to me when I first learned them. But the main reason that it's notable is because there are actually very few of this type of bridge left in the world. The Wallace Avenue Pedestrian Footbridge is one of the few that's still standing. But they built it in 1907 because it was an incredibly cheap type of bridge to build. And, as far as they knew, this was just going to be a temporary fix until they figured out something else. So why spend a ton of money on it? But then, it was just, it was very effective. There was really no reason to take it down. It didn't have any structural deficiencies. And it just became kind of a beloved neighborhood landmark. So they kept it standing and you can still see it there today. And if you want to get to Dundas West from the Junction Triangle, it's still kind of the best way to do it. And here's just a lovely sunset view over the Wallace Avenue Pedestrian Bridge. Very close to the Wallace Avenue Pedestrian Bridge is a slightly less beloved Junction Triangle. Well, it's not there anymore, but it was for many years. So at 370 Wallace Avenue was the Glidden plant for many years. It opened in the neighborhood in the early 1900s, right along with many of the other earlier industrial operations in the city. And for many years, it sat on that corner producing paint, varnish, and a truly disgusting amount of pollution. I have a couple. So this is the map at the time. This is from 1918, revised in 1918. So we have here the layout of the Glidden Varnish Company. So you can see manufacturing right in the middle, next to many, many houses on both sides. As well, we have a lovely advertisement for Glidden and an article from 1947 about a blaze caused by the Glidden plant, which was, as we'll find out, not the last incident that Glidden had in the neighborhood. So by 1981, between all the pollution and various blazes, etc., Glidden was really beginning to wear out their welcome in the neighborhood. For years, neighborhood residents had been complaining about the pollution and all its side effects, the noise, the disregard for their neighbors, and possible health effects that many people in the neighborhood attributed to industrial pollution from polluters in the area. Glidden wasn't the only one, but it was one of the worst. So in 1981, Toronto's mayor at the time, Art Eggleton, finally decided that he would try and do something to address all these concerns. He moved to pass a bylaw that would give the city additional oversight in factory operations. So anytime they would want to make a major change or expand their operations, they would have to seek the city's approval first. Glidden was not very happy about this, and they immediately filed for an exemption against this bylaw. Likewise, their southern neighbor, the Nacan factory, which was just on the other side of the street, was also not very happy about this. Nacan produced, among other things, the glue for Canada Post plant, post stamps, and together Glidden and Nacan both filed for exemptions from the bylaw. So a land use committee took a look at these, they took some time to evaluate, and on April 5th, 1982, they delivered a recommendation that yes, Glidden and Nacan should be exempted from the bylaw. Unfortunately for these two plants, the recommendation truly could not have come at a worse time for them, as less than 24 hours later, the Nacan plant experienced one of the very worst chemical spills in the neighborhood's history. A night shift operator had miscalculated when mixing chemicals, and rather than own up to his mistake, he decided to try and cover it up by dumping 4,000 liters of toxic glue chemicals into the city's sewer system. As you might imagine, this did not go quite as he thought it would, and by 4 a.m. on the next morning of April 6th, the city was receiving many panicked phone calls from residents wanting to know what the source of the horrible smell coming through the sewers and into their basement was. Three schools had to be temporarily shut down, and 7 people were actually hospitalized from the effects of the chemical fumes as the city took care of a cleanup attempt. Then, about a year later, in 1983, 2 valves were left open on a tank at the Glidden plant, and 2,000 liters of flammable liquid vinyl chemicals were dumped into the sewers. Once again, several households had to be evacuated while cleanups occurred. And given all this information, you might not be surprised to hear that in the end, NACAN and Glidden did not get their desired exemptions from the bylaw. More than that, these 2 incidents finally caused the city to take the Junction Triangle's pollution problems seriously, and they ordered a study on the industry's effect on the health of residents in the area. The study found that children living in the area were, in fact, more likely to suffer from runny noses, itchy skin, and throat irritation. Despite all of this, Glidden still continued to operate in the city for several more decades and only finally closed down in 2001. However, the reign of terror over the neighborhood was not yet quite over, as they had left behind what Now magazine called in 2008 some of the most contaminated former industrial land in all of Canada. That same year, soil remediation began on the site and began storing up many volatile organic compounds that had been left behind, which once again caused residents to suffer from headaches and nosebleeds. By the time remediation attempts finally concluded in 2009 and the piece of land was put up to sale for developers, most people in the neighborhood were probably more than happy to close the book on that chapter of the Junction Triangle's history once and for all. But before there was Glidden, there was, the very first industry in the neighborhood. So we're going to go on to our next stop and talk about some of those very first operations, as well as some of the other very first institutions, important institutions in the community. So to do this, we're going to be looking at the intersection of Perth and Earnest Avenue, which was a pretty influential early intersection in the neighborhood for a number of reasons. So the first being that prior to the neighborhood being a neighborhood, in its very earliest days, there were only 7 occupied houses in kind of the whole area. Enter savvy developer Simeon James, perhaps better known for developing the annex, but also technically the main developer of the Junction Triangle neighborhood, as he had bought up cheap swaths of land in the area during the Depression of 1879. He was determined to develop the area into a growing community. And so he started just building the infrastructure needed to support that. So houses, schools, churches, and anything else you might need for a neighborhood. As they say, if you build it, they will come. And within just a few years, tenancy in the area had improved significantly. One of these first institutions that he constructed was Perth Avenue Methodist Church, the very first church in the area, which was located on the northwest corner of Earnest and Perth. The church at first had no resident pastor, and so they were bringing one in by the rail lines once or twice a day to conduct services. The church's varied congregation was made up of both rail workers and Bell telephone linemen bunking around the corner, as well as growing families putting down roots in the area. By 1913, the congregation had swelled to such a size that they needed a new building and moved up the street to Wallace and Perth. The new building was constructed by G.M. Miller architecture firm, who are actually the same people responsible for the iconic downtown music venue, Massey Hall. However, in a narrative that may be familiar to many of us who live in Toronto, the church building, while still standing at the corner of Perth and Wallace, the new church building, is no longer a church, it is now condos. Regardless of how you feel about this approach or some of the broader issues around adaptive reuse, the silver lining of the situation is that in redeveloping the condos, they did choose to maintain the building's pre-World War I era architecture. And so when you go by, the facade is still there. You can still take a look at this beautiful building, although you may not be able to go to church in it anymore. Now you have to buy a condo unit if you want to go in. But back to the intersection of Perth and Earnest. So in addition to being home to one of the very first churches in the area, it was also home to one of the very first factories. And once again, my slideshow is not changing slides, but I imagine it will in a second. So hang tight for that. In the meantime, okay, yeah, here we go. So in 1904, a fire raged through downtown Toronto and destroyed 125 businesses, including many factories. One of the factories destroyed was a planing mill owned by John C. Gilchrist, who we can see on the left of the screen here. And he took this as his cue to get out of the packed city center. He set his sights on the budding industrial landscape of the Junction Triangle, and in 1906, he opened a planing mill on the corner of Earnest Avenue and Perth Avenue. This was, as I said, one of the very first factories in the area, and he bought a house right next to it and lived there all the way up until his sudden death in 1930 at the age of 67. In addition to John C. Gilchrist and his planing mill, some of the other early industrial operations in the area included a plant producing Old Dutch cleanser, Watt Milling and Feed Co., the dry battery manufacturer Canadian National Carbon Co. Limited, the Toronto Wire, Nail and Tack Co., and food manufacturers Cowan Co. Limited, who made cocoa and chocolate, and Tolfer Bros, who made biscuits. And on Perth and Earnest today, there is actually still some vestiges of the industrial landscape that once, was all over the Junction Triangle. So today, it is still home of the headquarters of Ontario Hardwood. Ontario Hardwood, for a time, took over the land of John C. Gilchrist's planing mill, which you can see in the image on the left. There's once again, we have another fire insurance plan showing the layout of that operation. But so now we're in this area right here, Ontario Hardwoods, this building still remains, but everything behind it that was once the warehouses of Ontario Hardwood and before that of John C. Gilchrist's planing mill are now actually gallery spaces mostly. But that is kind of how one of the very early examples of how industry came to the Junction Triangle neighborhood. Of course, with all that industry, there was a bit of a ballooning population, and that led to some other issues for the neighborhood. And so one of those we're going to talk about right now. We are looking at a stretch of roadway, which for about 14 years was one of the most hotly contested stretches of roadway in all of West Toronto. Also known as the half-mile gap, which we'll get to why in a second. But by 1911, Bloor Street had become a busy thoroughfare between, the ballooning population of the Junction Triangle and all the industrial operations in the area. Bloor Street was busy with pedestrians, with cars, and as well, of course, with rail lines that crossed Bloor Street at both the east and west sides of the neighborhood. There was also freight trains. And so at the time, crossings were level, which meant that the freight train was crossing directly across the street. You can see that in this image here. That's Bloor Street looking east towards Lansdowne at the time. And so, as you might imagine, freight trains barreling across a busy intersection several times a day was not great for public safety. And collisions and pileups happened with such regularity that people began referring to both of these train crossings as the Bloor Street death traps. Many people agreed that something must be done, and so the city's engineering department turned their attention toward the issue and came up with the solution of installing subways. These subways are not subways like we're familiar with today, as in underground trains. What that actually meant at the time was just installing underpasses, so the trains would continue on at road level and the road there would go underneath. This is also known as grade separation in many cases, just anywhere there's like two levels of transportation. So that was the city engineering department's solution they proposed, which was, pretty simple, but pretty expensive at the time. The price tag was $800,000. That is not with inflation. That's how much it would have cost then. So at the time, that was very expensive. And the Northern Ratepayers Association in the area was not in favor of that price. They were generally in favor of grade separation, but they thought that this particular proposal was overpriced and underthought out. So the two kind of found themselves in a deadlock. And then just a variety of other things happened that were a bit more pressing. There was a depression, and then World War I happened. So all of a sudden, this issue of grade separation was kind of put on a back burner for a while, for about a decade. The question wasn't actually reopened until 1921. And at that point, the population of the area had continued to grow, and Bloor and Dundas had become home to a busy commercial district. So if it had been bad before, things had only gotten worse in the ensuing decade. And so once again, the conversation of doing something about the crossings, grade separation, maybe something else, was reopened. At the same time, this kind of provided an opportunity for some people to throw a second topic into the fray, which was the issue of the half-mile gap. So at the time, the streetcar line that went along Bloor only went to Lansdowne and then it ended. So anyone living to the west of Lansdowne was not having a great time getting further into the city. There was the streetcar line that ran along Dundas West, and that went from downtown up to the Junction area, but still it wasn't super accessible for everyone. So a lot of people living in the Junction Triangle and further west were pretty cut off from Toronto's downtown. So they were hoping that maybe that could be changed as well, if people were looking at making some changes to the roads. This kind of led to an endless 2 years of bureaucratic back and forthing, with one controversial option after the other put on the table and then shot down. One option, a proposal to install a streetcar loop up Lansdowne, was so unpopular with residents that about 50 of them turned up at a city council meeting chanting, "Hands off Bloor Street until Bloor Street is fixed right." Finally, in May 1924, a whole 2.5 years later, after the conversation had initially been reopened, Toronto's Board of Railway Commissioners declared that Toronto's death traps must go. The city would be getting 2 underpasses, or subways, one under the Lansdowne train track and another under the Dundas rail line. People in the area were very happy about this, and so was the TTC, as this meant that they could finally extend their streetcar line and the half-mile gap would be closed. Construction began in July 1924, and you can see a picture here of some of that construction on the right side. At this point, this is July 1925, so the grade separation probably would have been completed. The underpasses would have been installed, as you can kind of see on by the sidewalk too, the slope there, and they would have just been installing the streetcar track. So this was at the very end, because then construction concluded in August 1925, which was just over a year after it had begun. And to celebrate the newly beautiful installed subways, as seen in the picture to the left here, the city threw a parade, which got so out of control that a planned address by the mayor had to be canceled. This was important for many reasons that all this happened. For one, it reduced car crashes and fatalities on Bloor Street, which is, great, very important. And for another, it also ended up connecting the Junction Triangle and much of Western Toronto to the rest of the city. It also laid the groundwork for some of the transit lines that we know and love today. When the Bloor Danforth subway opened in 1966, it rendered the streetcar lines above ground obsolete, but it did follow the exact same route that the initial streetcar extension laid the groundwork for. And now, once again, almost a century after grade separation was a hot topic in the Junction Triangle neighborhood, it is once again on the table as a big discussion point with Metrolink's Davenport Diamond Project, which, if it is completed as proposed, will build a new raised guideway on top of the Barrie-Go corridor to ease congestion on the line. So once again, changes are afoot in the neighborhood. But that's not the only change that has been coming or is coming to the neighborhood in recent years. Our next stop, which the PowerPoint is going to change to in just a sec, I'm sure, is actually a home of some recent upgrades and updates in the Junction Triangle neighborhood. It's 158 Sterling Road, and this, some people may be familiar, is home of Toronto's Museum of Contemporary Art. So the MoCA arrived in 2018, and is considered a big part of the revitalization of the Sterling Road area, which on the map is right here. But even before that, the Tower Automotive building, which houses it, has had many different tenants and names. The Tower Automotive building was initially constructed in 1919, and at 10 stories tall at the time, it was one of the tallest buildings in the area. It towered over basically everything surrounding it. And this was especially noticeable because at the time, the CN Tower wasn't actually even built yet. So it really stood out in the landscape. The very first tenant in the building was the Northern Aluminum Company. At the time, the demand for aluminum products had surged during the First World War, and so the industrial hub of the Junction Triangle was going to be a perfect home for them to produce their aluminum products. So they moved into the Tower Automotive building and made cooking utensils and military supplies for the Canadian forces. By World War II, they had cornered about 3/4 of the total aluminum production market across the British Empire. And although sales did drop by over half in 1946 after the conclusion of the Second World War, they managed to rebound and stayed in the neighborhood all the way up until 2000. At that point, a corporate takeover handed the building over to Tower Automotive, an aluminum auto parts maker. But they weren't really very long for this world in the Junction Triangle neighborhood. They're also why many people know the building as the Tower Automotive building, as its second most recent tenant after the MoCA. So by the early 2000s, industry in the Junction Triangle had been in decline for many years already. And the Tower Automotive building quickly followed suit. In 2006, they filed for bankruptcy and left the area, leaving the building just to sit abandoned for almost a decade until it was announced as the new home of the MoCA in 2015. When they announced their move-in plans, they had a grand vision for 5 floors of galleries, offices, studios, and were also at the center of a elaborate new plan for the whole area. So the MoCA is actually at the center of the 8-acre development project known as Lower JCT. This project has proposed to add parks and community spaces to the Lower Junction Triangle area, as well as new daycare facilities and space for 2,500 new jobs and 10,000 new residents. So on the image to the left here, you can see this is just like a Google Map snapshot that's more or less from, right now. And so the area pointed at there that's the MoCA. Other than that, you can see behind it right now, there's basically nothing. And then on this image on the right, this is one of the plans drawn up for the development proposal. And so you can see they've added community spaces, parks, new buildings. They want to install a new private road. They also want to actually change the current roads a bit. Perth Avenue right now, you can see kind of does a weird little intersection there. They just want it to continue smoothly into Sterling Road. So a lot planned for the area. But even before the MoCA moved in, changes were already afoot in the Lower Junction Triangle. Newer, hipper businesses had been moving into the area for a while, and industry, as I said, had been in decline since the 1970s. So with all that, many artists and entrepreneurs had been moving into the area, finding cheap studio space in many of these abandoned industrial buildings. But in a pattern that we've seen, again and again in the Liberty Village area, in Dundas and Carlaw, as the surrounding residential zone begins to expand and revitalization work begins, many times property values begin to really increase. And that is certainly what's been seen in the Junction Triangle so far. One particular building, 213 Sterling Road, home to many studio spaces, saw their rent in 2015, right around when the MoCA development was announced, increase by up to 80% for all tenants, many of who were visual artists or performing artists, and were really left with no choice but to move out in most cases. And with the museum being, officially open in the area now and more development taking place, the value is very likely, almost certainly, only going to continue to increase. People are coming to the area for art and culture, but at the same time, many artists and culture workers are being driven out of the area. At the same time, ever since it's open, the MoCA has done a fantastic job of showcasing many different Canadian artists and acting as a site for community engagement. And the Junction Triangle neighborhood overall has proven that they can be a really viable incubator for, small independent businesses. So what is the answer here? There really isn't an easy one. And as this continues to be an ongoing process, it'll probably take the neighborhood a while yet to figure it out. Now, after having talked about the neighborhood's future so extensively, we're going to take one last look into the past on our last stop of the tour. So this brings us to 128 Sterling Road. You may be familiar with this if you've been in the area, as home of now it's Henderson Brewing, the Drake Commissary. It is a very large former industrial site, which we'll have some photos of right now. So it's this building here. And we're gonna, at this stop, talk about a couple ghost stories. So the first ghost story I'd like to tell you actually begins west of the Junction Triangle, slightly in Toronto's Junction neighborhood, where in 1897, a nameless fellow was found dead in a railway underpass just north of Dundas and Keele. He had been heading home from a night of heavy drinking at the Subway Hotel when someone had bashed the poor guy's head in and turned out his pockets and left him there. The murderer was never found, but some argued that the real culprit in this situation was booze. And this guy's death became one of the key arguments in some people's prohibition passing efforts, which were eventually successful when they got 56% of the vote in favor to have alcohol banned in the Junction neighborhood from 1904 to 2001. Some legends say that the ghost of the murdered man wandered the neighborhood, unable to be at rest or set free until the curse of prohibition was lifted from the area. If that is the case, you must be very happy today because ever since prohibition ended, the Junction neighborhood and the neighboring Junction Triangle have become meccas for beer lovers, with many new breweries finding homes in these old abandoned industrial spaces. In the Junction Triangle alone, we have Halo Brewing, Henderson Brewing, as previously mentioned, which is also what this story has to do with 128 Sterling Road, because in 2017, Henderson Brewing released a limited edition beer, The Ghost of Prohibition, named after the victim and neighborhood ghost. So that's our first ghost story. Our second ghost in this at 128 Sterling Road can be seen all over the building. Any of these signs that you can see on the building are actually known as ghost signs. And you can find these all over Toronto, few probably quite as like lovingly restored as these ones have been. But by looking at them, you can often piece together the story of a building's former tenants, which these ones definitely help you do, but I'm gonna fill in a couple additional details. So as you can see with these signs, one of the building's first tenant was T.A. Little and Company, and this was owned by Thomas Alexander Little. He had moved to Canada from Northern Ireland in 1871, and he began working at William Wilson's Vinegar Works, which was just one of two vinegar production operations in the city. That is until T.A. Little went rogue and opened up his own operation, where he also began to produce ketchups, jams, and jellies and pickles, a stroke of genius that took the hard work of preserving off of consumers' hands. These products were a hit, and by 1908, he had gained enough success to make the move to Sterling Road, which was also weirdly perfect because he had a product line at the time called Sterling. So it was a beautiful fit. It was a match made in heaven. So any of the signs at 128 Sterling Road for pickles, ketchup, sauces, etc., that's all from T.A. Little's time in the building. Then a lot of the other signs that can be seen on the building are from its second tenant, Skies & Co. And so the building also has many signs, which again, when the slide changes, we might see in a second, for canvases, ropes, flags, that sort of thing. And so Skies & Co. produced those products out of the building for almost a century. They were the tenant who moved in immediately after T.A. Little & Co., and they actually only left the building in 2014. Just prior to that, in 2010, the building was purchased by a company called Tram Developments, and they were the ones who made a point of restoring all of these ghost signs to celebrate the building's heritage. With so much history happening in this area in the past, century plus alone, it's really nice to have things like these ghost signs to keep the past alive as the Junction Triangle moves steadily into the present. In the late 1800s, rail traffic came to the neighborhood, and in the early 1900s, heavy industry. By the late 1970s, rail traffic was in decline, and much of the industry in the area had shuttered, moved away, although some remnants do still remain to this day. One example is the Nestle factory, which is just south of 128 Sterling Road. And if you're ever in the area and you catch a whiff of chocolate, that is most certainly where it's coming from. Now in the last 20 years of this new century alone, so much more new change has already come to the area. And as we've seen, much more is planned for it. So, who knows what will happen next in the life of the Junction Triangle? But while few things are certain, if we can draw any conclusions based on the past, it is that just like the railway lines surrounding the area, the Junction Triangle will continue chugging steadily forward into the future. And yeah, that's it from me. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody. I think Jeff's gonna, oh yeah, you know what? Jeff's gonna jump in with questions now.
Yeah, I am. Quinton, thank you so much for that. That was really excellent. Although I have to say, between the Glidden Reign of Terror and the Bloor Street Death Trap, I wasn't really quite prepared for such violent imagery. But we always need a thrill, I think, to look forward to. I also just want to remark too, I love the name of this tour because it, the Junction Triangle very much is a neighborhood in motion. Just some of the examples you just brought up there, from its indigenous past and the significance with that to heavy industry to today, where it really is becoming, this new hotspot in the city with all kinds of different industries. It's really interesting to see that full story.
Yeah.
So just see, it doesn't look like we have any questions yet, but maybe while people begin to add them, maybe Quinton, you can share, when you were developing this tour, is there one story in particular that stood out to you or that you really identify with?
Oh, Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think it's really interesting to talk about the stuff with the mocha, just because I mean, I think, you know, it is a really complicated question in the area. And you know, what I think it's an interesting dilemma that a lot of neighborhoods in Toronto have maybe already gone through. And I think it's really interesting to see that playing out with the Junction Triangle specifically. You know, and I think there's definitely a lot of questions about what's going to happen next to the neighborhood, but I hope it can kind of, you know, find a line between those two things. Like I think there's so many fantastic things happening in the area, but you know, also I would love to see it continue to be a home for the artistic communities, which have, you know, obviously played such a big part in making it like a cool area that is desirable in these ways now. So
Yeah, and hopefully with the Mocha in like such an iconic building in the West End of Toronto, you know, that can continue to happen. We have one question just on your last point in your presentation. Someone's wondering if you can speak more to the history of the Nestle factory in the Junction Triangle.
You know what, I have to say, I don't know that I can. I don't know a lot about it. I think yeah, I'm not sure.
You know, honestly, I've been there. I've smelled the chocolate before. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's, you know, going to be the next kind of like ghost story. People will just, whenever Nestle leaves, hopefully they don't, but they'll just continue to get, you know, those wafts of chocolate as you're walking through the neighborhood. I have another question here. Someone's asking, why do you think the neighborhood remains such a unique space within Toronto today?
Interesting. I mean, I think honestly, part of it, I mean, I think it's maybe the fact that I think there's a couple of things. I think one thing is it is interesting that it was so recently industrial land, and like obviously, you know, speaking to the Nestle factory continues to be like it hasn't all moved out, or even with Skythes and Co, like they were there right up until 2014, which is especially interesting when you think, you know, I mean, you think of that building now, you think Henderson, Drake Commissary, but like up until very recently, they were cranking out like flags and canvas and stuff in there. So I think, you know, maybe in some ways that has kind of, it feels a little bit more like everything surrounding it feels a little bit more like it has, you know, developed, and like in many ways the Junction Triangle still does kind of feel like a space where, you know, it's a little bit different than all of its surroundings. It does feel like kind of there's this opportunity, or it's just, yeah, it's definitely like feels a little behind schedule compared to many other things in Toronto. So I think that's really interesting, and having that mix I think has just created like a really, you know, interesting texture to the neighborhood, that kind of, it has all those things at once. And I think it's also, you know, pretty cool that like people could be living in the neighborhood and working at those buildings up until so recently for many of them, or, you know, in the case of the few places that still remain there, still can.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you have inspired at least one person. Susan just said she doesn't know the area, but you've inspired her to go visit. So I encourage everyone on the tour right now, if you have the chance, go visit Junction Triangle, go walk on the Toronto West Rail Path, go, you know, Drake Commissary, go check it out because it is a really neat part of the city. So I think we'll start to wrap things up there. But if any of you on the call right now, if you have any outstanding questions that you do want answered, or any questions about Heritage Toronto, you can email them at info@heritagetoronto.org. So I encourage you to reach out to the organization if you need to. One last time, I want to thank you, Quinton, again for that wonderful presentation, a really great tour. Hopefully I can do it in person next time, because it would be great to see all those amazing sites in real life. But the virtual version was also great, so thank you again. And I also just want to thank our 2021 presenting sponsor, TD, as well as Andrew and Sharon Himmel and the Himmel family for making this tour possible. If any of you really enjoyed this tour, please be sure to check out all the other great tours and programming that's happening this season, both virtually and in person. If you go to our website, heritagetoronto.org, you can find that under the What's On section. And of course, we're very proud to be a donor-driven charity. I'm sure as many of you can imagine, you know, over the past year, donor support has really allowed us to continue serving Toronto by prioritizing emerging historian opportunities, developing new tours, and expanding our digital programming, and basically just, you know, making sure that Heritage Toronto can continue serving the city. So I really encourage you, if you haven't yet, and you believe in the importance of engaging with our past and sharing, you know, the great passion we have for the city and its history, please consider taking action and joining our circle of donors or renewing your support. Otherwise, with that, there's some information there on the screen if you haven't got a chance to copy it down. But thank you again, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful evening.